You spoke about globalization, interconnectedness, and fragmentation, and you used the word competitiveness in terms of that fragmentation. And I'm thinking that we're also talking about volatility as well as the hierarchization that happens with fragmentation. And I think one of the things that hit people hard in Africa and other parts of the global south was seeing the idea of hierarchies emerging in how the world saw them with the crisis in Ukraine. So the hierarchies in terms of racial hierarchy and who you are, your identity. In some ways, I think that was eye-opening for people in the Middle East, in Africa, and certain Latin America as they tried to flee back. What's powerful is that they took a message home, which helped with the media construct of Russia. But opposing that image is the fact that China has, like you said, been taking the governments one by one, starting from when it rolled out the red carpet and flew all the heads of state to China many years ago to kind of tell them, here comes China. So you have these relationships of fragmentation at multiple levels. And when you spoke about the divide between civil society and the people, it might sound idealistic, but I think the picture we're seeing here is that on one hand, you have the US trying that civil society diplomacy, build up, post-Cold War with, get involved in farming and stuff like that. And then you have arms coming in and you have Russia targeting the governments. So I'm wondering, in this, you asked about policy, in this situation of a very volatile fragmentation, do you see a role for some of our regional institutions, the mechanisms? Because the language of saying international community is offensive often. When the West says international community, they mean Western international community, nobody else. And so if you're thinking civil society, we're thinking about the architecture of our regional mechanisms, is there a way that we can also focus on rebuilding them and then think about that, how matches interest towards building peace, a kind of consensus, like was done against, things like toxic waste dumping and things like that. So I'm just curious because we can't fold our hands and say, it's impossible. Same time, we can't keep focusing only on the idea of the major powers and not think about what countervailing powers we have in the global south. Thank you.
Wow. That's a packed one.
There you go. Okay.
Honest. You are right. Again, that's one aspect where the war in Ukraine was very eye-opener. The racism and the racial discrimination, etc. And even I will go as far as saying, when I talk to some of the African leaders, the US always tell them, oh no, we can't disburse money so quickly. But we saw how billions are going so quickly in Ukraine. And they notice, people notice. When it takes 3 years to sign an MCC compact. Susan, you know what I'm talking about. 3 years to sign an MCC compact of $100 million. In Ukraine, we can disburse $1 billion in less than 2 weeks. People will tell me it's easy to buy weapons than to build roads. I get that. But that's the image. So you are right, that the Ukraine war has revealed many things, discrepancies and some form of racism as well. But I will say, at least the Biden administration, has the tone right with Africa, at least. That's why the Africa Leaders Summit was such a success. People wanted to come here because they got it right in terms of the tone, in terms of Africa is a partner, etc., etc. Now we hope to see the delivery of some of the promises. Coming back to the regional architecture, that's a strength for Africa. We have one of the most complex, most elaborated regional, multilateral system in the region, with the African Union, the regional economic communities, etc. But as I said at the beginning, this transition is, I think that architecture is becoming less and less effective in this transition, right? Because, for example, the IGAD in Sudan, the IGAD is there, they are trying to resolve this conflict, right? But what can they do when the parties are supported by the Emiratis, Egypt, by Saudis, who are pouring in weapons. So it's just difficult for that regional economic community to resolve that conflict without bringing in these parties, without bringing in the United States, Russia, Wagner, etc. So same thing, ECOWAS in Mali, right? After the coup d'etat, the ECOWAS has a charter where we are against coup d'etat, etc. So there were sanctions against Mali and the rest. But guess what? China came in because Mali has lithium and put it $1 billion. So you can sanction all you want, right? So again, we have to find those regional mechanisms exist. They have kept us safe for some time, but it's time to reinvent them. It's time to refit them so that they can be fit for purpose in this context. So.
Thank you. Vali Nasir, who's an expert in the Middle East, could you bring us up to date in terms of what's the impact in the Middle Eastern region?
Well, thank you very much. The Ukraine war's impact comes at a time of other major issues also happening at the same time. And I have to say, as bad as the news often is, if you looked at it that way, I think as an educator, and to my students, etc., I find it actually fascinating and a very exciting time, because it's very rare that students can go to school and go to classroom at a time when you actually have major changes in the world, and they can basically analyze it, look at it, and not just passively, if you would, just read material. So, for the Middle East, the effects really actually started much earlier, which is when, during the time of President Obama, the United States ultimately made the decision that it had spent too much time in the Middle East, too much effort, too much resources, and it had to pivot to Asia. And now you could say the war in Ukraine makes that pivot much more definitive. As far as Middle East is concerned, it doesn't matter where the United States pivots to. It's that it's pivoting away, which means that the Middle East's importance is being brought down. Now, again, looking at it historically, for a region that has been used to being front of mind for the United States for such a long time, this was a massive shock to the system. Mm-hmm. And it has had other reverberations. For instance, now we complain that China and Russia have come into the region, which is actually an object lesson for the United States, that just because we're not interested in a region doesn't mean that others might not be interested. Or we're now shocked that Saudi Arabia decided to solve its problems with Iran on its own without us, with the Chinese. And so, as I said, these are all sorts of new elements in the region that has to do with the fact that our attention is somewhere else. I think one of the very first impacts of Ukraine on the region is to convince it that the United States is definitely gone, because it's going to be involved in Europe and with Russia, whether Russia wins, doesn't win, is defeated for the foreseeable future. And if you add that to China, then it doesn't matter what the United States basically says, that it's a whole new world in the Middle East. Secondly, and connected to this, is that the issues that are in the region, the tensions, et cetera, have become much worse. First of all, the United States is not there, which means that the countries in the region have been competing much more without any referee in between. And then the issues with Iran have become much more aggravated. And I have to say, this is somewhat of a self-inflicted wound by the United States, when President Trump came out of the deal without being able to restore it, and then President Biden not being able to get to a deal for whatever reason, which means that Iran is rapidly becoming a nuclear threshold state, which then either means that basically the international non-proliferation regime could collapse, because if you have a new country coming through the system, or that the United States would have to get engaged militarily in a way that it doesn't want to, or that you might have a conflict in the region around Iran. And also, Iranians are also convinced that it doesn't matter what the United States says, it doesn't want to go to war in the region anymore. It doesn't want to come back. Mm-hmm. So they're not deterred, if you were, or fearful of U.S. involvement. And now, because of the Ukraine war, they are rapidly building a strategic partnership with Russia, because Russia is becoming heavily dependent on Iran for varieties of things, economic as well as military. I mean, most of Russia's trade with the world now goes through Iran and the Persian Gulf. It no longer goes through the Mediterranean for strategic reasons. The third issue is that the Ukraine war is basically reformatting economic geography of the region in ways that was unanticipated before, which is now there is an imperative for Europe to get all its gas from the region. It is investing in gas in Iraq. It's getting gas from Qatar. It wants gas from the Eastern Mediterranean. No more Russian gas. The only other place that gas can come from is either the United States or from the Middle East. Now, gas that comes as liquefied natural gas is inherently more expensive, which could be detrimental to the long-term competitiveness of European economies. They need gas that is not liquefied, and that means ultimately building pipelines that connects Europe to the Middle East through Turkey, which has created an incentive among all of these countries to sort of think very differently about their relationships. I mean, that's why it's so important for Saudi Arabia and UAE to mend ties with Syria. Who cares about Assad? Who cares about that? The most important, and I think the Europeans quietly are going to come to the same conclusion, that we're going to hold our nose, pretend we didn't see it, but that pipeline ultimately has to go through Syria in order to get to Turkey, to then go to Europe. As I mentioned, now overwhelming amount of Russian exports are going through Iran to the Gulf. Dubai, even though UAE is a very close US ally, Dubai is becoming a massive financial, oil transactional, commercial transactional hub for trade with Russia. It's not called that, but that's where a lot of these goods are going across the Gulf into Iran, onto trucks and railways, etc., to Russia and back. I'll just give you an example. Like now, almost all of Russia's coal exports to China go through Iran, no more through the Suez Canal. And all of India's exports to Russia go through Iran. And that's actually, for instance, connecting the north part and southern part of the Gulf in ways that wasn't the case. Now, again, I tell my students, we often don't think like this. We say there's a war, there's a bad guy. We don't think about secondary, tertiary impacts of how it can actually reformat a whole region. And United States is leading the Middle East because we always had a security view of it and oil. We don't need the oil, and the security now, Putin is much more threatening than bin Laden was in our mind. So our focus is there. But ultimately, where Russia and China have economic interest, the Gulf now has an economic interest in collaboration. And you could think that in the long run, given where China and Russia are going with the United States, that the Middle East is going to get integrated into their world.
Yeah. Very good. Well, thank you all for coming, and to our panelists as well. And I understand that there's going to be more wine and eating later on. But this has been very informative and insightful. Thank you all for coming. Thank you.